Hi everybody, welcome to part 3 of chapter 6, and we're going to talk a little bit about music from the 1970s on and show you some other things that aren't in the textbook but I think are worth looking at. It's hard to talk about the 1970s in terms of rock and lots of other types of music because the formats became so interchanged and people liked a different kind of music. What I thought I'd do is this is just a page full of covers of particular albums that I like from the 1970s and the 1960s and in some cases the 80s. And your own personal choices may be totally different. One of the things that I found interesting to do is I went to a website and found like the 100 best songs, rock songs of the 70s and other kinds of sites, and it's a good starting point. So really hard to narrow it down just to 15 in this case, and there were many, many more that I put on my list. But just as an example, and everybody's a little different, I put some of the albums that I like and I listen to still to this day repeatedly. One of them is an album that came out in 1971 called Blue by Joni Mitchell. And it's a collection of, it's in the upper left-hand corner of the slideshow here. It's a collection of pop, rock, ballads, and by one of the most iconic folk rock artists of the century. I'm a huge fan of Jethro Tull, so I've pictured the Aqualung cover of that album there, also on the page. I've been to a couple of Tull concerts over the years. The first time was back in the late 70s. Another group that pioneered rock in the 70s was Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young. I've seen them in concert. And this is their very first album called Deja Vu. If you're at all interested in exploring a lot of their hits, you can go there. I'm also a big fan of Led Zeppelin, and the next cover, the fourth from the top left, is Led Zeppelin 4, which has many of their best songs in it. And so that's part of their whole British invasion type genre. The Eagles, this happens to be a greatest hits cover, although most of the songs were done in the 70s that are on this album. If you're looking for something a little softer, more ballady, the second row, Carole King put out an album called Tapestry that I probably listened to 100 or 200 times. It was my mother's favorite album from the 70s, and she's a balladeer, but she also rocks it out pretty well. She's still performing these days. I also put on there Bridge Over Troubled Water, one of the albums by Simon & Garfunkel. Again, started off with pop and folk, but they got kind of a harder rock edge in a lot of their songs, and they each had individual careers. For something completely different, I'm a big fan of Van Morrison. He put on an album in the 70s called Astral Weeks, and I think it's his best recording. Most people know Van Morrison from his songs like Brown Eyed Girl. You've probably heard that on the radio more than once. This is a little bit more mysterious and melodic and poetic kind of stuff with good heavy rock beats and blues included. I'm a big fan of the first Boston album that came out in 1976. It's got most of their big time hits. Their second album and third album and however many albums they had later didn't have as many of the classic Boston songs that you might expect. Just also for going back to the rock ballad kind of thing, I've got James Taylor's album. He put out many. This one's called Sweet Baby James. It's got a lot of his hits in it. And the bottom row on the left, I'm not necessarily a huge album listener of Fleetwood Mac, but their Rumors album was quite good, quite different. Contained some really good drumming and bass playing and lead guitar playing and vocals by Stevie Nicks. In the 70s, I kind of got to be fans with the groups like The Clash and the Sex Pistols. So London Calling by The Clash is the classic sort of a punk rock type album, if you want to call it that. And it marks that sort of period of the 70s where, in punk rock, where 60s and 70s, where sometimes you couldn't make out all the lyrics. People were screaming it. The music was very raucous. It was hard to tell sometimes what they were singing, so you forced you to kind of listen to the songs over and over again. Stevie Wonder, I'm a huge fan of him, and the album that I've put there is Songs from the Key of, in the Key of Life, which is one of his better records. I recommend you do that. And kind of for the heavy metal, hard rock stuff, I like Black Sabbath. The Paranoid album is pictured there. And the last one on the bottom right is an album by the Rolling Stones called Sticky Fingers. And as I recall, some of the original records had an actual working zipper on the front of the album. And this was quite controversial. They were taken off some shelves because of the erotic nature of the image. The later reissues and reprints just had the zipper printed as part of the art. So that's my little quick tour of some 70s rock classic albums for me. It'd be interesting to see what, when you do Blog 1, if you want to pattern yourself after a certain type of group or certain types of singers who are alive for your Blog 1 exercise, which is posted on this week's module 2, or what your personal choices might be. I think they probably vary quite a bit by your age, the types of music you were influenced by your parents and friends and siblings, and to some degree also just your own personal eclectic tastes in music. That reflects mine. It may not reflect yours. I want to talk about some other aspects of particular types of rock in the 1970s. That's a picture of David Bowie there on the right. I don't know if that's in his Ziggy Stardust mode or one of his other costumes. David Bowie passed away last year and is greatly missed by a lot of people that liked his types of work. Glam rock, there were a lot of different types of practitioners of this. Usually people dress flamboyantly, they put on heavy makeup, and they pose, and that's why I use this particular picture of David Bowie, because he's showing all those attributes. David Bowie was a very good songwriter and performer, and a lot of his stuff was done live on stage, and he also worked in various other formats. So when you think of glam rock, you're thinking of David Bowie, early Elton John, where he dressed up in furs and huge sunglasses, and a guy named Gary Glitter, who, if you're not familiar with him, you can go online and look at his work and his type of stuff. Following glam, or as part of glam, disco, and it's sort of, I define it as a low-key glam plus electronic music. And probably you're familiar with some of these performers. KC and the Sunshine Band had a number of hits. Gloria Gaynor, the Bee Gees, and Donna Summer, and they were predominant in the 1970s, which was when disco was popular. I admit that I owned a white or beige leisure suit in full polyester mode, which was one of the things you wore if you were going to go out dancing at disco clubs at the time. The person who people most associate in mass media with disco is John Travolta in the movie Saturday Night Fever. So it's a good movie to watch if you want a sense for the disco era. The other people there are worth listening to, certainly. Some of them are still performing in various incarnations. And 70s was a time when glam and disco, although they still exist today to some extent, particularly in some other countries, it's kind of fallen by the wayside as being mainstream American music. The Sex Pistols, Anarchy in the UK, was an example of the punk movement. Very minimalist, very anti-corporate, sort of angry rock. This is the punk end of glam rock to punk. Overamped chords, screamed lyrics, often political in nature. And a lot of times, if you just like when you listen to heavy metal, listening to punk, you couldn't always understand what they were screaming about. But there was a lot of energy put into stage performances, a lot of way overamped amplifiers and music and stuff like that, a lot of intentional distortion. Same thing kind of happened in the metal movement, which I'm not going to talk about too much in this chapter, but it certainly played an important part in my education in the 70s. The center of the universe for punk music was a bar in New York called CBGB, very small bar. There were other places in New York and other cities where the punk rock scene was really heavy. In a place like the Midwest, you got watered down versions of that. You got a lot of neighborhood bands or local bands or people trying to perform that may or may not have had much in the way of talent, but the energy and the attempt was there. In the U.S., punk rock was the mainstream versions of punk rock were best represented by a band named Television. That's not television as in a TV, but a band called that. Blondie, who's pretty well known, and the Ramones, who's are Joey and the Ramones are kind of a cult figure in punk music. I think Blondie and the Ramones are particularly groups that you should check out if you're not used to that. So, as I said, the problem with punk was anybody who could have an instrument, whether it was in tune or not, and could scream out lyrics without having to carry a melody, could become a punk rock musician or form a punk band. It created a whole number of very untalented bands, but the ones who used studios and polished their music and tried to make sure people could hear things produced some pretty good listenable music. It spread to the UK. Some people would say it spread from the UK to the US. It's kind of hard to determine that. But in the UK, a lot of the lyrics were less about politics and more about unemployment, class divisions, having an upper or lower class, particularly a poor lower class. People were trying to get out of situations, and their lyrics often reflected that anger at being not economically unviable type of country like Britain. And in the UK, the main stars were Sex Pistols, as are pictured here in just one particular picture, and a group called The Clash, which actually is a pretty good band. They put out a song called Rockin' the Casbah. If you haven't heard of that, you want to experience The Clash, go find Rockin' the Casbah and play that. The Sex Pistols stuff is pretty graphic in nature in terms of the lyrics. That whole band had an interesting history, and there was suicide and drug use and all kinds of weird craziness going on, so they're interesting to read up on too. I want to spend some time in that bridge years between the decades between the 80s and the 90s talking about hip-hop. There's a picture there of Grandmaster Flash and the Furious Five. Hip-hop was, and I'm generalizing a lot here because people say that rap and hip-hop are separate. Some people say they're kind of the same thing. Some people say that they each borrow elements from each other, so I'm just going to call it hip-hop. The origins of this music, you could argue that it started in other countries to some extent, but the true origins of hip-hop were begun in the Bronx in New York by black youth who were, when I say disenfranchised, was the same kind of situation that there was happening in the UK with punk, is that there weren't a lot of job opportunities, employment, there was a lot of unemployment and underemployment, educational opportunities were lacking, jobs were lacking, and so this hip-hop movement actually started by people who were protesting their lives. So originally, hip-hop included original lyrics, and I call them street lyrics because they were about what life was like on the street or within their own families or relationships. Doing some rapping, doing sampling, which is taking samples of other music and lyrics and other from music and other forms of media and including them on their own recordings. And then probably what we're used to is seeing the club versions of scratching records or actually creating sound effects on records by letting them roll, letting them spin, and then ultimately stopping them and scratching them back and forth to create sound effects. So, as I say, hip-hop was really kind of all about everyday life in inner cities. It was about crime and poverty, drugs, relationships between people, both individual and in terms of how they felt about the places where they lived. And it doesn't mean that the people at all were always downtrodden, because some rap artists, some hip-hop artists have gone on to, were positive from the beginning about affecting social change. Others were trying to make the world aware of the situations they were living in and asking for mainstream society to do something about it. So that spun off into breakdancing, graffiti art, and I'm not going to just say graffiti because graffiti can be a form of art. Fact that people migrated to certain types of T-shirts and even sportswear. This is where, in the early days, especially, you saw, people wearing certain brands of athletic clothing, depending on who they wanted to identify with. And a lot of hip hop is based in funk, soul, and jazz music, along with some aspects of other types of spoken word methods. So when you think about some of the key hip hop artists in the early days, you're talking about Kool Moe Dee, Grandmaster Flash, Public Enemy, Ice-T, Run DMC, Beastie Boys, and Ice Cube later on. And these are all key players to know in the world of hip hop that if you're interested in starting a serious discovery of the origins of hip hop and these particular bands, that's a good list of some bands to start with. There was kind of a division between hip-hop artists based on West Coast artists and East Coast artists. West Coast artists tend to be a little more gangsta. Tupac Shakur, who's pictured there in the bottom left, excuse me, and Snoop Dogg, as opposed to East Coast artists who dealt with a little more traditional themes of the urban environment, like Notorious B.I.G. and Sean Combs. And the reason I've got Tupac and B.I.G. In photos down below is because there was a rivalry between the East Coast and West Coast, and the events that transpired are really complicated, and it's hard for me to explain it just in a slide, but basically Tupac was killed in 1996 and B.I.G. was killed the next year, and in pretty messy, bloody deaths. And some people claim that there was a rivalry between the East and the West Coast practitioners, and that helped cause it. Some other people you might be aware of is Dr. Dre. I listened to him sometime. Eazy-E and Ice Cube, who came later. But if you want to know two people involved in hip-hop that were pretty well known, it's Tupac, Notorious B.I.G., Snoop Dogg, and Sean Combs, along with Dr. Dre. So because they used a lot of improvised lyrics in some cases, because they wrote out lyrics that were close to the heart, because they relied on a lot of rhyming slang and things like that, because they spoke in the methods of people that they lived with and around, they became very effective at conveying a certain type of music. And hip-hop, rap, those kinds of music are tremendously popular in the U.S. to this day. This is not a 1 or 2 decade flash in the pan. They started and they grew. They've grown and grown and grown and gotten even more popular. I want to talk briefly about alternative rock in the 80s. The picture in the bottom right corner there is sort of the iconic, it's a portion of a Nirvana album cover. The album's called Nevermind. Interestingly, they toss this little baby into a swimming pool to get this shot for the cover, and you can actually in this version see the little piece of fishing line that's hooked to the dollar bill. And they tossed this baby in about a year or so ago. The guy who's now 25 or 30 or whatever recreated the photograph just for fun, and actually he was trying to make some money off the deal. And you can find, if you do a search, you can do for Nirvana Boy, you search for that, you're going to find copies of the original cover, and you're also going to find examples of this guy in his 20s or 30s recreating to some extent the same photograph. Except in the second photograph, you can't see his genitals, so there you go. But one of the forms of alternative rock was grunge, inspired by hardcore punk and heavy metal. It was based in Seattle, starting about the mid-1980s. The fastest way to identify a grunge band for a long time was they all wore plaid wool shirts, and that seemed to be kind of an unofficial uniform of a lot of the bands. Sound could be kind of what the book calls messy or sludgy, distorted electric guitars and lyrics. And Nirvana is a key example of that kind of thing. Kurt Cobain, who was the leader of that, who committed suicide, uh, his lyrics are very, very dark. The sound is kind of overamped, overloaded. Sometimes there's a whole bunch of crashing, heavily chorded guitar in there. Sometimes it's hard to make out the words, but it was kind of this and other types of muttered lyrics that kind of, in some cases, identify grunge people. So a lot of times, like I said, they didn't care about what they dressed in. They weren't into like uniforms or looking snazzy or something necessarily. They wore just like DAV plaid shirts and kind of had what we would call a disaffected stage presence. They acted like they didn't care. Some of these bands are still around. When you think of Soundgarden and Nirvana with Kurt Cobain, they're bands that had a really strong grunge impact. And then later on, they inspired bands like Green Day, Nine Inch Nails, and Pearl Jam. And I think probably you may have heard of one or two of these groups. Surely you've heard of Nirvana at some point in your life. If not, that album actually, Nevermind, is actually an extremely good album. And it's worth a download or listen to a few of the songs. And you may or may not like some of the other bands. Some of the early Green Day albums are pretty good too. So again, just kind of a thing that happened in the 80s, and it did kind of, although some of those groups are still performing, maybe not as popular as they used to be. Boy bands. Boy bands came along in the 1990s. There were boy bands in previous decades. Decades, just like there were girl bands in previous decades. We're talking here about Backstreet Boys and NSYNC as being a couple examples of boy bands where they had very polished, rehearsed, multi-choral type arrangements. They definitely were chosen to appeal to the other sex or maybe to the same sex, but definitely try to put together a real polished fan magazine kind of approach. Very, very, what's the right word? Choreographed. Girls bands like Spice Girls were also popular, mainly in the 90s. And this continues to this day to some extent, but those are some of the ones that were really popular. And then you had a little bit of a rebound from the 70s and 80s when people like Michael Jackson and Madonna were popular. And then later on, Prince came back, particularly the album 1999, which was a really solid effort by Prince, who passed away again last year, and Michael Jackson, who passed away a few years ago. Madonna is 58-ish and still going strong. At least she's producing material and holding concerts and things like that. So 90s, this was kind of a pop version of mainstream music. It was popular for quite a few people and popular among the listening public. So when we talk about the 2000s, we're looking at the rise, particularly of female pop stars: Christina Aguilera, Destiny's Child, Gwen Stefani, Mariah Carey, Beyonce, Katy Perry, Lady Gaga, and again, many of them are still performing to this day. I'm trying to remember the group that Gwen Stefani was in before she went solo, and I'm drawing a blank at the particular moment here. But she produced with another guy some really good albums, some really great lyrics and music by her. Also, the 2000s when country stars started to cross over to pop, people like Carrie Underwood and Taylor Swift, and it created a trend, continued a trend to where you didn't have to be locked into one particular genre. You didn't have to be a rock star. You didn't have to be a pop singer. You could cross over to country or gospel or other things. And musical artists have been doing that for decades. But this was the first time they really, in country, kind of did a crossover kind of thing. Hip-hop gained in popularity. Kanye West, Jay-Z, Outkast, great group, Outkast, 50 Cent, Eminem, Mos Def. And so I've given you a couple of pictures there. One is of Destiny's Child, and one of them is of Kanye there on the bottom right. So in the 2000s, that was a decade where, yes, there was mainstream music in various genres, but these are three trends that were populated the 90s, or 2000s, I should say. Now, I didn't mention the 2010s because pretty much in the current decade we're in, about anything that you might imagine goes. We mentioned in an earlier slideshow that the world is full of everybody's own particular tastes, blends of tastes. It's really hard to say what particular genres are most popular. Rock is still popular, country is still popular, rap and hip hop are very popular, and then you start dividing it off into other types of forms of music. So I didn't want to try to preach what was popular at a time when it's kind of up in the air. There's a chart like this in your textbook, but this one is a year newer. This is from Nielsen in 2014, and it shows basically the four major labels that own everything. And you know, if you think back to when music was started, and particularly in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, and 60s, there were many record labels out there. I mean, that was kind of the thing. Once you launched, even if you worked for Capitol Records, let's say, back in the day, you would launch somebody in a new career under a new label. Nowadays, the consolidation has meant that really four main music publishers own most of everything. So Universal has a 35% share of that. The next highest would be Sony, followed by Warner. And then the smallest chunk is from EMI, which is an older label. And independent labels have kind of grown and grown over the last several years, making up about 12% of the who owns music labels. But you still see that because of this media conglomeration, that it's really hard if you want to break into one of those major labels. You usually have to start as an independent and work your way up. There's very few people who get signed to one of those four major labels just straight out of the bat, straight out of the block. And frankly, the major labels can provide more in terms of support, merchandising, promotion, helping things get recorded, professional production and things like that, actually working with people in a band or a singer to improve their things. If you're with an independent label, you're kind of on your own for the most part as far as that. You may be selling CDs or downloading MP files off of your own server. And as I mentioned for the very first slide of this chapter, which is that the internet has become a more popular way of distributing information. Another one that I found on the Nielsen charts, I don't think this is in your book, but this is from 2015, is a graph, a chart on what we listen to. And this kind of backs up what I said. Rock is a huge category. Pop, R&B, and hip-hop are huge. Country is big. And then it breaks down to smaller and smaller and smaller sorts of things. So whereas jazz at 2% here would have been huge in the 30s and 40s, in terms of what we listen to, it's a relatively small, specialized, niche listening kind of thing. Christian gospel is still staying pretty strong. Latin music, which compromises a huge segment of what I was calling world music, is growing, actually, and becoming bigger and bigger. How do we find music? And this is just a quick chart that is not in your chapter, but I found it and I thought it'd be interesting. The number one way we discover music is through radio. Number two, surprisingly, or maybe not so much, through friends and relatives. Number three is movies or movie soundtracks. And so then you can kind of get to where you can see as you go down the road, people don't find out or don't discover music as much from magazines and online music news and video games and things like that. And surprisingly, only 9% get music from the official website of a band or an artist. I think that's much lower than I thought it would be. But that's kind of an interesting chart there. A few other things. That is Metallica and that's Dick Clark. These are just random thoughts that I pulled together from some of the addendum material and also things I want to talk about. Dick Clark in 1957 started an amazingly popular program called American Bandstand. It's still available online. You can see it. And it lasts from 57 to, I'm guessing, sometime in the 80s or early 90s. I didn't check that. I got to meet and talk to Dick Clark quite a bit when I was covering an event here in Wichita over several days. Very nice, polite guy. They would, it would be kind of like in the early days, was kind of like in black and white TV, it was a sock hop where they played some popular tune that week and the teenagers would all dance, and then they would have young people come up to a microphone and say, well, it's pretty good, it's got a good beat, I'll give it an 85, that kind of thing. And they would have a rating system. And it was a tremendously effective way, using that program, to introduce music to a whole generation of people in the 50s, 60s, and 70s and 80s. And in my day, it came on Saturdays. And it was kind of like Saturday morning or Saturday noonish. And you pretty much everybody tuned into it to find out what was hot that week. This is pre-internet. This is pre a lot of other things. Unless you read particular music magazines like Rolling Stone, you may not be up on what's going on. And even Rolling Stone didn't start publishing until, I believe, 1971 or so. So Dick Clark is an important person to remember and know about. One of the things that happened back in 1999, I don't know if anybody has read about or heard of a program called Napster, a service called Napster. And this was one of the first attempts, if not the first attempt, to do what was called file sharing. Translation, there was a guy who decided he had this bright idea. He was going to take music he owned and give it away to the public. And unfortunately, almost all of the major record labels recognized that it was illegal, and it still is, to not pay for copyrighted music. And they sued him, and every one of them won. And so that Napster went out of business. Now, the first of the major musical piracy cases was filed a few years later by the band Metallica, because a lot of their music was being ripped off. People were sharing it and sending it to each other, and whole sites filled with tens of thousands of songs were available for people to download music for free. And I'm assuming that some of that still exists. But to answer the question, and this will be on the first test, is downloading copyrighted music for free legal? And the answer is no, it's not legal. Now, you may have a moral feeling about that, whether you're entitled to that for free, but keep in mind that artists are just like anybody else. They work for a living. They put a lot of money and effort and time and sweat equity in their problem. There's a reason they copyright their work. They want to be compensated for it. So you may disagree with me, but I'll tell you right now that stealing music is illegal, and you can be and will be prosecuted for it in many cases. If you continue to do it, then that's your choice. This is America. I mentioned early on, we talked about the internet, about indie labels also, and one of the reasons why we use the internet is for many reasons, like I mentioned, but primarily because it's a low-cost way to distribute your music. And some indie artists do distribute free music, at least initially. There have been a few major artists that have allowed free downloads of entire albums. They're already established, but they still want to give back to their fans. But in most cases, people who are in the music industry are partly there to make money. Real quickly, a couple things about censorship. There was a big to-do about explicit lyrics when Tipper Gore who was Al Gore's wife when he was vice president, had a congressional hearing to talk about explicit lyrics, things that shouldn't be in records, in her opinion. And Congress basically heard her out and took testimony on all sides. And there were some pretty important musical stars of the time who testified against her. And it kind of led to one thing, and that is occasionally you will see an album or a CD or a cassette or a link will say explicit lyrics. They have to put that warning label on, kind of like the Surgeon General puts a warning label on a pack of cigarettes. That's primarily because of those Tipper Gore hearings. Walmart also had a big brush up with Sheryl Crow, of all people, a few years back, where she was wanting to put something on the cover of her album, a piece of art or a lyric or something like that, and they actually pulled the record from their shelves. And Walmart has a history of doing that back in the 80s and 90s and 2000s primarily, because they didn't want to offend mainstream customers, because they didn't want families bringing kids in to look at naked people on the cover of albums. I don't think that was Sheryl Crow's issue, but a number of those kind of things of censorship. So, I think in America we think that the general attitude of the public and musicians is that we should be permitted to express ourselves how we want, and if people don't like it, they can not buy it, or they can go turn somewhere else. But some people do care very deeply about things like explicit lyrics in music, and they're entitled to have that opinion too. And actually, just wanted to hit one more time the importance of digital record stores like Apple iTunes, and many other forms of places where you can go to download music legitimately and pay for it. I think that although that is still, we're still getting an awful lot of people downloading, buying music conventionally, increasingly downloading music through the internet legally or illegally is the way we're headed, because some of the actual formats that we produce music on are becoming dated. CDs, they've been saying for several years now, are on their way out the door. And they've given way partly to digital formats, but some of the current digital formats, like MP3 or MP4 files, also will give away to other forms of digital media that we don't have anymore. Just like we started with Edison records and went to reel-to-reel, went to 8-track and cassettes, and phonograph records, and different kinds of things. Technology keeps changing how we store and reproduce music. And lastly, technology changes all the time. We don't ever know when the technology is going to change the way we collect music. I know people that had vast collections of CDs, hundreds of them, and they basically threw them away because they switched to getting all their music digitally online as downloads. And some of them were upset because they spent all these thousands of dollars acquiring music. And some people were like, it's just progress or change. Well, I hope you've enjoyed listening. I've had a good time. I'm sorry there's been some technical delays. Had to do with Blackboard and how it processes videos. But I'm thankful we finally got everything taken care of, and I'll see you next time.